Welcome to Conversations on the Coast. We have a lot of authors who come by here, but after looking at this gentleman's background, I've decided, Frank, that you may be the most distinguished guest ever. Our most distinguished guest, Frank Deford. We're talking now about his latest book, Over Time, My Life as a Sportswriter, published by Atlantic Monthly Press. Thanks for stopping by, Frank.
That's high praise. I hope I can live up to it.
Well, I'm just reading from the jacket flap. You've written so much, including now 18 books. You've won so many awards, like U.S. Sportswriter of the Year 6 times, and you served a stint as a fabled light beer all-star. Could you tell us a little about that and your, quote, friendship, unquote, with the wonderful late Rodney Dangerfield?
The guys on the Light Beer All-Stars were as nice a group of athletes as you could find, and there's a reason for that. I mean, what Light Beer was looking for was washed-up old athletes, right?
That's
so
true.
If you're not trying to win, you're just trying to get a bunch of fun guys, then you look for good guys.
Right.
They were all just wonderful. And as a matter of fact, I was a little nervous when I joined the troop, if you will, because I'd written about some of these guys. And, I didn't know how they would handle a sports writer. And they welcomed me, right into the bosom of their family, if you will. And the one jerk in the whole thing was Rodney Dangerfield. And you remember his line, I don't get no respect.
I don't get no respect.
Well, he didn't deserve any respect. And I think there was a reason for that. I think that he was intimidated. He was out of his world. This was an entirely different environment for him. He could handle hecklers in a nightclub, put them down. But he couldn't handle these athletes. And the funny thing is they were prepared to meet him halfway. But he was a bully. He had no sense of humor. I know that sounds crazy, but he had no sense of humor when he was around these guys. He didn't know. You know how guys on a team, any team, kid each other, right? That's part of being an athlete. And he didn't know how to kid. He could stand up before a crowd and tell jokes.
Yes.
And at one point he got mad at me because I had written a silly little book. And I said, and I had leaned over actually to be pretty generous to him. But I had said that he didn't necessarily, was not a highlight of the, he came up to me in the middle of a shoot. I mean, we were actually shooting the scene, and there was a break, and he's pointing a finger at me, and he's screaming, and he's going to sue me. Apparently, he sued people all the time. I was saved by Ben Davidson.
What a savior!
Great Ben Davidson. What a wonderful guy. Of course, he used to play for the Raiders.
Yeah.
And Ben just told him, take a hike. And he, again, because he was a bully, I mean, I didn't want any problems. I'm a nobody. The last thing I want is any.
Oh, dear.
And Ben had a deep voice. He said, all right, Rodney, move on, or something like that. That was the end of it.
That was gone.
That was it.
Bye-bye, Rodney.
It was like I wanted to turn to Ben Davidson and say, my hero.
One of the things that you point out early in the book, you kind of comment on one of the big differences in covering sports today versus days of yore. You write in part that one of the great ironies of writing about sports is that the most important people in sports are young and unformed, and consequently, if through no fault of their own, less interesting. At least back when Granny Rice was cataloging the triumphs of the young Lochinvars, he, like his colleagues, could rave on in his dispatches about the heroics on the field. The Babe wallops another four-master, the Manasseh Mauler pummels another challenger, the four horsemen are outlined against the sky, even though you observe I'm looking down at them from the press box. But now, with television, everybody with a clicker is privy to seeing the same thing, clear as day on HD, as are the pros on the scene with media passes, so you have to eschew the games and write about the athletes as people. So it's kind of like a new task, isn't it?
It's It's a much harder thing to do. And as you quoted me, it's not the fault of these athletes that they're young and unformed. Personality travels behind physique, if you will.
Yes, it does.
Maturity.
Yeah.
And so we have this irony in sport where the characters who are the most famous, the ones that people care the most about, can often be the most boring. They've had success all their lives, starting with the time they were 10 years old.
Right.
And nowadays it's even worse, of course, because literally 10-year-olds are made heroes of, right?
Right.
They're 10-year-old All-Americans. People rank fourth graders and stuff all around the country.
Yeah.
And then as you get older, this is the other problem. As you, the sports writer, get older,
Mm-hmm.
you move away. You lose even whatever connection you had when you were younger. At least you were contemporary. And I have a line in Overtime in which I say, you know it's time to move on when you can't stand the music in the locker room.
Very
then
true.
You know you really are.
In Overtime, Frank Deford reveals many unwriterly things about his life. We'll look at a couple of them when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Overtime, My Life as a Sports Writer. That's what we're talking about today. The author, Frank Deford, has been good enough to join us. His book is published by Atlantic Monthly Press. And a man who's on television a lot in this market, San Francisco, and who tends to annoy me sometimes, has some great things to say about the book. He's Tony Kornheiser. Frank Deford is the best sports writer I've ever read. His profiles at Sports Illustrated were magic. I wanted to write like him. And the sad part for me was that I knew he was playing in a higher league. If there's a Mount Rushmore of sports writing, Deford is up there. Purple ties and all. What has he got against your ties?
Well, I wear a lot of purple.
Yeah, well, it's right on the jacket.
And yeah. So Tony was just throwing that in. Listen, when he says something as sweet as that,
yeah,
he can criticize everything I wear from my socks to my underwear. That's fine.
That's true.
That's really dear of Tony to speak so highly of me.
In this book, you confess to a number of what I think of as unique things, and one of them is that you had a happy childhood in Baltimore.
Terrible thing for a writer.
Yeah, and you've been married 46 years to the same woman.
Terrible thing for a writer.
And you don't play golf as a sports writer?
That's an insult to all sports writers everywhere. I'm just an anomaly, and the worst part is having that happy childhood when you're writing a memoir.
Yes.
Because you want people to think that you've pulled yourself up from your bootstraps, that you were born in abject poverty, right?
Yeah, well, it's like going to the well and the well's dry.
I just and I can't fall back on that. I was a very, very lucky guy. I even said, I figured it out once.
Yeah.
That I was born at exactly the right time, which is to say, I was born in December of 1938, meaning I was conceived earlier in 1938.
Yeah.
1938 was a recession in the middle of a depression, which is nobody but my parents were having children then. So that I had less competition than anybody else in the 20th century. It was the best time to be born in the 20th century.
Thanks to your brave parents. Huh?
God bless them.
God bless.
And so even in terms of demography, I had a break. I just simply can't pretend that I didn't have an awful lot of advantages.
Well, let's not put Baltimore down. I made a pilgrimage there to the old ballpark And then shortly after it opened, I got to Camden Yard. And the one thing that impressed me about the new ballpark was that I could go, I think, behind the right field stands, and I could buy barbecue from Boog Powell.
That's correct.
And you mentioned Boog Powell when he played, that he lived real near the ballpark and would just walk out, get some beer, go home and eat crab.
He and I imagine this was true for many ball players of that era who weren't making a whole lot of money. Boog lived in one of those Baltimore row houses.
Yeah, washing the steps.
Exactly, and you know, it gets hot in Baltimore and humid in the middle of the summer, and people would sit out on the stoops at night, and Boog would walk home. You know, he was most valuable player one year. He's just short of Hall of Fame.
Yeah,
and Boog would walk home from the ballpark through the parking lot, and everybody, you know, would say, "Hey, Boog, did you guys win tonight?" Maybe some of them didn't even watch the game, and he might say, "Well, yeah, I went 2 for 4 with an RBI or whatever," and then they would all sit down and have beer and crabs together. It was a working man's town. There were some of the Colts. I didn't know them. This is a little bit before me.
Yeah.
Who literally had jobs in factories. And would work the morning shift and then go practice in the afternoon.
Oh, my word!
And then you know, play a football game on Sunday. Johnny Unitas did a lot of floor work. He was laying floors and in his spare time. I mean, it was again, in many respects, it was an advantage coming from Baltimore because it was such a homely place in a way, and I mean that in a sweet way. It was a working man's town. We didn't take, you know, nobody was high hat in Baltimore.
Well, wait a minute now. There was a big hero there, a woman who was expert at duck pins, and I mispronounced her name. Is it Toots Barger?
Toots Barger.
Toots Barger.
And Toots was probably the most famous athlete in Baltimore. Look, we had no pro teams. Not after the Orioles went to
New York.
New York in around 1904 and eventually became the Yankees. We had no pro teams. The Bullets did come in.
That's right.
But they played at a place called the Coliseum, which was the most misnamed place you ever saw. I think it seated 2,500 people. What a dump.
Yeah.
And unlike a lot of cities which didn't have major league pro teams then, Dallas, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and so forth, we didn't have any college teams either.
That's
and
true.
So the biggest thing in Baltimore,
you had Johns Hopkins.
Johns Hopkins lacrosse, okay,
lacrosse,
or Toots Barger and
duck pin.
And bowling, duck pin, not regular bowling, but duck pin bowling. For some reason, Baltimore was the center of duck pin bowling. You get 3 balls. They're the size. They're a little bit bigger than softballs, and you get 3, not 2. And the story always was that they were invented at when John McGraw back in the 1890s, when he and Wilbert Robertson had a bar in town.
Yeah.
That's where they were invented, and they were called duck pins because when you would hit them, they would fly like ducks. The ducks would always fly with the Chesapeake Bay, and that was it in Baltimore. Toots Barger and Johns Hopkins lacrosse.
And Toots was, you know, preceded Earl the Pearl by many years, I take it.
And of course, that was another part of growing up in a way, the right way. I've always said that I'm a different person than had I grown up in New York or Washington or someplace that, you know, felt self-importance. I learned modesty at an early age. You were modest in Baltimore.
You know, Frank Deford has admitted to writing with ease, which we didn't get into, what we were supposed to, but now he's also a broadcast journalist. Hard, easy, we'll find out when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter @JimFosterCoc and email Jim Foster, COC@gmail.com.
That is I. Overtime is today's book. My Life as a Sportswriter is the subtitle. The author, Frank Deford, who not only writes sports, he works on radio and television. His book is published by Atlantic Monthly Press. And a gentleman by the name of Buzz Bissinger.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct.
He wrote Friday Night Lights.
Friday Night Lights and Father's Day. Says, among other things, is there anyone who writes about sports with more elegance? Is there anyone who writes about sports with more humor, insight, and a style all his own? Nope. Frank Deford is the best there is. His memoir, Overtime, is beautiful, funny, poignant, and poetic. It's a privilege to say these words about him. Wow.
No,
Can't you just see the paperback edition? Frank Deford is the best there is. And then underneath it, it'll say, I deny that, Mrs. Deford.
Well, the irony is, too, I appreciate, I never set out to be a sports writer.
True.
And I just wanted to be a writer. That's all I ever wanted from the time I was 8 years old. And could learn how to write and found out I could do it well.
Yeah, but when you went over for an interview out of Princeton at Time Inc., spelled I-N-K, you realized if they had said some nasty things on your resume folder that you should shoot for Sports Illustrated.
Well, Sports Illustrated was the only, to my mind, it was exceptionally well written. It was the only well-written magazine that Time incorporated. If you remember, Time magazine was written by group.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
It was essentially, a bunch of people would write every article, and then every editor would then rewrite it. Life magazine was basically a picture magazine.
Right.
Fortune was the other, and that was a dull business magazine. Sports Illustrated was wonderfully written, and I thought that's a place I'd like to work, not because of the sports, though I love sports, but because it was just such a good literary journal. The managing editor was a guy named Andre Laguerre, who I devote a whole chapter to. How often do you find that your first editor or your first boss, in any profession, turns out to be the most distinguished that you'll ever have in your whole life? Laguerre had been de Gaulle's press secretary during the war.
Mm-hmm.
He'd been literally plucked out of the flaming waters off of Dunkirk. I mean, he knew everybody. A Frenchman who made Sports Illustrated work in the United States, and by the way, I should say, sort of with his left hand created the swimsuit issue. That
good
was
man.
Also Laguerre.
A very, very good man, I would say.
And he told me once when I was, after I'd been there about 5 or 6 years, and I thought, well, maybe it's time for me to move on, that I've done enough sports. And sports writing is always sort of put down, and it's fun and games, and it's not important, and all that kind of thing. And he said to me, Frankie, he used the diminutive with me because I was still a kid there. He said, Frankie, it's not what you write about, it's only how well you write. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's the craft, not the subject, that matters. And that mattered to me that he said that. It was very important in helping me to decide, well, maybe this is where I belong. I can write about
one of the places that you've also made your own over the years is broadcast. And one of the people who helped you in that is a woman with a strange name, Kitzel Levine. Tell us about Kitzel in your broadcast career.
Well, Kitzel was a young woman who was on the staff of NPR, and she was like the low girl on the totem pole, okay? Just a kid. And when Morning Edition was being created, they suddenly decided, at the 11th hour, geez, we ought to have something about sports. And we're going to be on, 10 hours a week. We ought to have something about sports. And because Kitzel was, the lowliest of, they said, Ketzelstein, get us some sports guys, okay? And poor Kitzel didn't know anything about sports. She called up her father, who was a sports fan, who'd been in Brooklyn, and he said, "Why don't you get Red Barber?" Red was retired down in Tallahassee.
Yeah.
She called him up. He said, "Well, you know, Red, with that Southern accent of his," he said, that sounded like a good idea to him, as long as they didn't have to leave the house to do it. So Red would come on and talk to Bob Edwards mostly about his azaleas in the opera, and occasionally they would mention sports. And then somebody, she can't remember who, said, you know, this is a guy who writes for Sports Illustrated who's kind of interesting. And I'd never done any radio, and so the idea that I could talk into a microphone was problematic. But she came up and proposed this idea to me, and I thought, well, you know, this is something I'd like to do this sounds like fun, you know?
Mm-hmm.
A diversion for a few months. That was in 1980. I've now done 1,500 plus commentaries.
Wow. For
NPR. And it's you know what's wonderful about it. Excuse me. It's talking to an audience that doesn't necessarily care for sports.
Yes.
And so often, those of us in sports journalism, whether we're writing or behind a microphone or in front of a camera, we're only talking, we're preaching to the choir, right? Everybody else already, you know, the reason they're watching or reading is because they like sports. And I get the opportunity on NPR to talk to people who really don't know much about sports. And it's that's a real luxury, which I enjoy.
Well, we get the opportunity now to remind our audience that they've only heard a little bit about this book. Here are some things we haven't had a chance to talk about. The involvement of Mr. Deford in a $150 million failure. The inside story on Arthur Ashe. And also, he talks at length in here about a man by the name of Edgar Sherrick, who ought to get all the credit for television sports and gets none. Overtime, that's the title, My Life as a Sports Writer. The author is Frank Deford. This has been Conversations on the Coast. I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.